Yevgeny Prigozhin was a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin right up until a few months before the plane he was on mysteriously exploded/crashed en route from St. Petersburg to Moscow in August of 2023. My next guest is the author of the new book, Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos. This book takes a look at Prigozhin's life as well as the history of the paramilitary organization he led, known as the Wagner Group. Candace Rondeaux directs Future Frontlines, a public intelligence service for next generation security and democratic resilience, and the Planetary Politics Initiative at the New American Foundation. She's also a professor at Arizona State University, and she joins me now. Candace, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
It felt like maybe not too long after Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were suddenly very much in the news. Tell us how we got here, starting with Prigozhin. What's his origin story?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long arc, and it does not bend toward justice. I can say that straight up. um,
Yeah.
I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin begins his life in St. Petersburg. He's born into an okay middle class family, but very quickly his father dies when he's very young. His mother is actually a doctor, and so they're you would consider them sort of upper middle class, nice sort of Jewish family, or at least sort of mixed Jewish and Christian family. Sort of the tail end of the Soviet era, although nobody knew it was the tail end then. He grew up having this ambition to become a ski master. Actually, he was a champion cross country skier. His stepfather got him a place at what was then the number one Olympic academy in the country in St. Petersburg. He went to school as a young boy, a boarding school as a young boy with Olympic champions. So he had these kind of grand visions of what his future was going to be like. Didn't really work out that way. What we know is that he had some sort of accident that threw him into a life of crime, and he, was a young teenage gangster running around the streets of St. Petersburg, terrorizing local neighbors, and that got him his first, duel with prison. Basically, he spent 9 years in prison on charges of violent assault and thuggery, which was kind of a crime then in the Soviet Union,
Right.
and and he kind of transformed his life in prison. That's one of the things that's really important to understand about him because, of course, as you know, later on, he becomes very involved in recruiting prisoners to join
Right.
his army. So his origin stories start there, but his political career or his importance to Russian history and his nexus to Putin starts at the start of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He comes home from prison to St. Petersburg. His stepfather, has a hot dog business that he helps manage, and he grows it into this sort of mini empire of kiosks. And around the same time, Vladimir Putin is returning home from a long stint in East Germany as a KGB agent, where had been handling so-called illegals, undercover, spies that were distributed all across Europe. Their roads converge just as the Soviet Union is collapsing. And Vladimir Putin becomes deputy mayor. And he also becomes basically the man with his hand on the lever of almost every aspect of business in the city of St. Petersburg, including licensing casinos, licensing grocery stores, licensing restaurants. And it just so happened that Yevgeny Prigozhin had interests in all three of those businesses. And they were brought together in part because of that sort of business relationship. Over time, he became I think Prigozhin became a really trusted, but shadow aide,
Right.
for Putin's political retinue. Importantly, he became the Kremlin's chief caterer, and
Right.
he, right, like, he kind of provided Putin with banquets for kings and queens. Whenever there was, like, a state visit from the US president, famously, of course, he provided dinner for George and Laura Bush when they visited St. Petersburg on several occasions, and so his rise to power was really very much tied to Putin's rise to power, and he followed him, or at least his businesses started to follow Putin to Moscow. And most importantly, he became a defense contractor extraordinaire in the early 2010s as the Russian military was transforming itself. So the origin story of Prigozhin begins there, but how he ends up leading the Wagner Group is a whole other story.
Well, let's get into that a little bit. So, what's sort of the origin story of the Wagner Group, and then how do they intersect?
The origin story of the Wagner Group is really about structural factors in the political economy of a country that has just gone through one of the greatest economic free falls, probably in recent modern times. The collapse of the Soviet Union led the Russia into this, you know, raging debt pit. It inherited the debt of its partners and neighbors, so notably Ukraine. It inherited debt from over expenditure on the war in Afghanistan. And one of the most important things is while, Prigozhin and Putin are making their way and sort of cutting it up as sort of new masters of the universe in St. Petersburg, there is this rise of sort of two important forces at the same time. And one is the rise of the mafia class, these kind of criminal underground contingents, most notably the Tambov crew, that start to merge with the security agencies in terms of an alignment of shared interests. There's kind of a marriage of convenience. And most importantly, they are the source of hiring of former Russian veterans who served in the Afghan war, who were really this huge disaffected group of men, on the order of certainly over 1 million, who sort of churned through one way or the other Afghanistan and the military over the 10-year period before the collapse. This merger between the mafia and state security agencies and the veterans is kind of the soup or the sea out of which the Wagner Group grows from the 1990s. The real kind of catalyst was a decision by the Duma and Putin at the time to try and reorganize state enterprises, most notably Gazprom, which is the big gas
Mhm.
company, Rosneft, which is a huge oil company, and then what we now know as Rostec. Those three companies provide huge amounts of sovereign wealth for Russia. And in 2007, Putin and the Duma passed legislation allowing those companies to hire their own security agencies, which effectively allowed them to hire their own private paramilitaries. But they're only kind of
Right.
private in name because the organizations that they work for, these state enterprises, are literally controlled end to end by the Kremlin.
Mhm.
Even the chiefs of staff, the CEOs of these, of Gazprom, Rosneft, Rostec, they're all presidentially appointed. So they're only private in name, basically. It is there that you start to see the burgeoning of these small private military contingents. And it is in 2013, on the tails of the Arab Spring uprisings that really rock everybody's world, including Putin's, that Putin and Russia's military leaders begin to insert these private contractors into Syria as a means of supporting Bashar al-Assad. So really, people think of the beginning of the Wagner Group as 2014 in Ukraine. It's actually much earlier than that. It really starts with the Syrian war. That's the big catalyst because Russia doesn't want to go full bore
Right.
because of the risk of confrontation with the United States, and so they send in these ghost warriors, basically. Including most notably Dmitry Utkin, who is the sort of nom de plume, as it were, or the nom de guerre, Wagner, comes from Dmitry Utkin. He adopted that call sign back in when he was working in Syria and then later in Donbass. So the origin story is really about sort of the economics of, collapse and then the economics of trying to revive Russia's state-owned industries. And the mix here, the glue was that mafia culture, and those veterans that were disaffected. It really starts there.
Wow. And the Wagner Group was known for its brutality. And when I say known, I don't mean that there were like whispers about it. I mean, they very much wanted it to be known and they very much publicized their brutality, didn't they? There are stories you tell in the book that I gotta be honest, I wish I hadn't read.
Well, I wish I hadn't watched all that footage, I gotta tell
Yeah,
you.
I'm sure. God.
I probably watched
Uh,
the footage of the Sledgehammer murder of Hamdi
oh my
Bouta, I
God.
don't know how many times, and it still haunts me to this day, to be honest with you. Yeah, I mean, look, the Wagner Group is a reflection of all of the things that, I've just mentioned. Mafia
Right.
culture, disaffected veterans, tough guys who are brought up in tough guy military culture. And for folks who are not as familiar with Russia's military apparatus, one of the more notorious branches for brutality, or at least, for psychological warfare, is known as the VDV Airborne. VDV just stands for Airborne Forces, basically. And so the airborne forces of Russia, they're also known as the Blue Berets. They're kind of like our, Green Berets in terms of kind of,
Mhm.
the legendary macho man,
Right.
out there doing hard stuff in hard places. So that's most of the early cadre of the Wagner Group came from the airborne forces or other elite, shock troop forces that were part of, the interior forces, police, elite police forces as well. And so they all had that mental cast of like brutality wins the day, basically. And in the Wagner Group, there was a sort of sadism. Actually, there's one defector that I talked to, his name is Murat Gabidul, and he talked about how the commanders in the Wagner always wanted to be more cruel than Prigozhin. They wanted to show their
Oof.
loyalty to Prigozhin. They often did like really crazy stuff to prove their prowess, and it became a little bit of a kind of self-licking ice cream cone in a way, this brutality. But also, of course, there is a value, in sort of broadcasting or advertising your appetite for brutality, right? Especially in places where you're at war, you're trying to control contested territory. If people think that Wagner is cruel and that Wagner is coming, maybe people will back off, and
Right.
there'll be less resistance. So that's really what it's about.
Okay, so we have this history of the Wagner Group, which is now being used in Ukraine. We have the long-standing close relationship between Putin and Prigozhin, and one of the things you write about is how secretive that relationship was for so long, and it went back much further than I guess we sort of originally knew. But how does all of that come crashing down in 2023? For those of us not in the know, it seemed very sudden. You have a trusted ally who launches what is essentially a coup attempt, and soon after that, he dies, more than likely killed by the man he turned against. But you say there were actually signs earlier than that that there was going to be this fracture between these longtime allies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are structural factors, and then there's just like personality problems that came up, right? The structural piece was Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group as a brand, as a concept, having a proxy army that would fight, in these foreign wars like in Syria, Mali, Sudan, Central African Republic, Libya. Having that kind of capacity is super useful, as long as it's deniable, right?
Right.
As long as you can kind of paint a picture that the Kremlin has nothing to do with those people who are involved in their own private corporate enterprise. And that starts to break down almost the minute the Wagner Group is called to mobilize to the front line in Ukraine, because now you're in a situation where it's clear that Russia has called them, first of all, right? And that they've answered the call coming from the Kremlin.
Right.
It's clear that they're fighting on the side of Russia, and there's no sort of two ways about it, basically. So the mask or the veil is lifted very quickly in spring of 2022, but it's really when Yevgeny Prigozhin steps out of the shadows and into the limelight, with that very famous video where he's in the prison courtyard saying like, "Join Wagner. What do you got to lose? You could spend your life here, rotting away in this prison, or you can go on the front line and gamble, and maybe you'll get amnesty, but your families will get money no matter what happens." And that was like this moment of sort of revelation, I think, for the world, not for me, and I think not for people who were paying attention to what
Right.
was going on with Prigozhin, but that was a big revelatory moment. But it was precisely at that moment that Prigozhin became even more less useful, right? The minute that he appeared to be somebody who was tied to Russia, he was also therefore tied to all of these atrocity crimes and war crimes that had occurred all over the world in the name of the Wagner Group, in the name of Russia. So that was a huge liability. So that's the structural factor. It's just the minute that the Wagner Group kind of came out of the shadows, the plausible deniability factor and the usefulness and the relevance became less of a factor for Putin. But I think the other piece was that there was this ongoing rivalry and people who were paying
Right.
attention to the Wagner Group, and it dated back years, right, between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Sergei Shoigu, who was then the Minister of Defense, a guy who had no military training, just like Prigozhin. Neither one of them had any military training, but they both wanted to be, big major donos. They had a lot of bad blood. And there were lawsuits, for instance, between the Ministry of Defense, the Kremlin, and Prigozhin's companies that were leaked. We could see those in the files. There were near fisticuffs between some people who were associated with defense ministry that were meant to be rivals to Prigozhin and so forth. But it's really in April of 2023, and you might remember this actually, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, he's out there on the battlefield, everybody knows him, and then suddenly there's a bombing, right, where this young military blogger, ultranationalist military blogger who was pro-Wagner, associated with the Wagner Group very publicly, and had been given permission by Prigozhin to run, this kind of military blogger
Mhm.
cafe scene out of one of his restaurants in St. Petersburg. Well, he gets blown up in April of 2023, and there couldn't be any more clear message. I think that that somebody was coming for Prigozhin. So I mean, there were a lot of these little hints. Many of them were subtle if you weren't really paying attention to the long history of Prigozhin's relationship with Putin.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And as you say in the book, I only have like a minute left, but I want to get to this. Much of what we came to know about Prigozhin was due to the extraordinary and sometimes extraordinarily dangerous work of journalists, dissidents, online investigators like Bellingcat. But speak a little to that and how important these people were to uncovering all of this.
Yeah, Yevgeny Prigozhin's downfall was really the fact that he couldn't keep anything secret, and
Right.
so many people were obsessed with trying to uncover what was behind the Wagner Group. I want to just absolutely mention Bellingcat, but of course there are a lot of Russian reporters, Ukrainian reporters, who really put their lives on the line
Yeah.
to tell this story. And if it hadn't been for them, I don't think we'd know today anything about Yevgeny Prigozhin, and maybe he'd still be alive, frankly, if all of those secrets hadn't been revealed.
Right. Wow, that's so interesting. The book is Putin's Sledgehammer. It is out now. It's an absolutely fascinating look at this story, and I encourage people to go pick it up. Candace Rondeaux, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.